The oak tree has been growing in this wilderness for 200 years. Its rough bark is covered with cracks, like wrinkles carved by time, but it still stands tall and points to the sky. In this place where even weeds can hardly survive, it alone supports a green shade. As if announcing to the world, life never succumbs to the environment. Margaret was an 8-year-old girl when she first saw the tree. That summer, her father moved the whole family from the city to a small town on the edge of the wilderness through the window of the carriage. She saw the lonely oak tree at a glance. It was not in groups like other trees, but stood alone in the middle of the wilderness, with thick branches and a crown like an umbrella. The sunlight shone through the gaps in the leaves, weaving a mottled light and shadow on the ground. My father said that this tree was the only miracle in this wilderness. No one watered it, no one fertilized it, and it grew on the barren land for 200 years. Margaret often lay by the window, staring at the oak tree in the distance. She imagined the wind, frost, rain and snow that the tree had experienced, how it took root in drought and stood tall in the wind. At the age of 12, Margaret approached the oak tree for the first time. She crossed the wasteland, stepped on the cracked land, and walked towards the green step by step. The closer she got, the more she could feel the vitality of the tree. The roots of the tree were deeply rooted in the ground like the fingers of a giant. The trunk was covered with moss and lichen, and the chirping of birds came from the branches and leaves. She reached out to touch the rough bark and felt a strange temperature, as if the tree had its own heartbeat. Margaret began to visit the oak tree every day. She sat in the shade of the tree to read, wrote her thoughts in a diary, and sometimes just listened quietly to the rustling of the leaves in the wind. She found that the tree was not lonely. Bird nests were built on the treetops, ants were crawling on the trunks, and a few tenacious little flowers were blooming around the roots. In its own way, it created a small ecosystem on this wasteland. When she was 15, a rare storm hit the wasteland. The wind howled across the earth, and raindrops hit the windows like bullets. Margaret curled up in bed, worried about the oak tree. The next morning, she ran to the center of the wasteland. The scene in front of her made her hold her breath. A main branch of the oak tree was broken by the wind, revealing the white wood, but the tree still stood upright, and the resin oozing from the broken branch shone in the sun like a drop of golden tears. Margaret looked at the wound and suddenly understood something. This tree never prayed for good weather or fertile soil. It just grew silently and looked for vitality in adversity. The broken branches will grow new buds, and the dry and cracked land hides stored moisture. The power of life lies not in how much you have, but in how you use the resources you have. At the age of 18, Margaret was admitted to a distant university. Before leaving, she came to the oak tree for the last time. The crown of the tree was still lush, and new branches grew from the broken branches, which were thicker than before. She stroked the cracks on the trunk and felt the vitality surging under the bark. The tree taught her the most important lesson. No desire is strong, no extravagant demands, no complaints, just focusing on growth. You can create miracles. Many years later, Margaret became a botanist. She traveled around the world and studied plants in various extreme environments. But in her office, there is always a photo hanging. In the middle of the wilderness, an oak tree stands alone and proudly, with its branches and leaves stretched out, as if to embrace the entire sky. Whenever she encounters difficulties, she will think of the tree. It taught her that the strength of life is not in demanding, but in adapting, not in possessing, but in persisting. Another summer, Margaret returned to her hometown. The oak tree was still there, but taller and more luxuriant. The shadow cast by the tree canopy was larger than she remembered, and the cracks on the trunk were deeper, but still upright. She sat in the shade of the tree, feeling the familiar rustling sound. A squirrel jumped from the branch, and a few leaves gently fell. For more than 200 years, the tree has witnessed countless such moments, but it has never changed its posture. Margaret closed her eyes and felt the power of the roots extending underground. The tree did not ask for fertile soil, nor did it crave more rain. It just grew with concentration, thus becoming the most powerful life in the wilderness. She finally understood that true strength comes from the awe of life, from adapting to the environment, and from inner peace. As the sun set, Margaret stood up and prepared to leave. She took a last look at the oak tree, and the crown of the tree was coated with a layer of gold in the sunset. When the wind blew, the leaves rustled, as if telling an ancient story about life, persistence, and strength. This story has no fancy words, no earth-shattering plot, but it contains the most profound truth. Life is strong without extravagant hopes. She turned and walked away, and the oak tree behind her still stood quietly, waiting for the next person to witness the miracle of its life. In this wasteland, it will continue to grow, continue to witness, and continue to tell the eternal truth. The strength of life does not lie in how much you have, but in how to use the existing resources. It does not lie in asking, but in persistence. It does not lie in extravagant hopes, but in focus. This is the story of the oak tree, the story of Margaret, and the story of all lives that persist in adversity. They tell us that when we stop extravagant demands, stop complaining, and focus on the current growth, life will show the most powerful power, just like the oak tree. It grows alone and proudly in the wasteland, interpreting the true meaning of life in its own way.